welcome to this year's Janus Forum. I'm Linda Shadler. I'm the acting provost at the University of Vermont, and I am really proud to be part of a university that will run events like the Janus Forum. We are proud of our history and culture of being able to have challenging conversations and leave the room shaking hands. I'm also proud to be part of a land-grant institution, and as part of that, I'm going to read our land acknowledgement statement. The campus of the University of Vermont sits within a place of gathering and exchange, shaped by water and stewarded by ongoing generations of indigenous peoples, in particular the Western Abenaki. Acknowledging the relations between water, land, and people is in harmony with the mission of the university. Acknowledging the serious and significant impacts of our histories on indigenous peoples and their homelands is part of the university's ongoing work of teaching, research, and engagement, and an essential reminder of our past and our interconnected futures for the many of us gathered on this land. UVM respects the indigenous knowledge interwoven in this place and commits to uplifting the indigenous peoples and cultures present on this land and within our community. The forum that we're about to hear is dedicated to what has become, alas, a somewhat audacious proposition. This proposition is simply this: that thoughtful, rigorous, and respectful debate remains possible even in this era of intense partisanship. The forum believes that the academy can and should preference deliberation over knee-jerk responses. It believes that engaging an opponent's argument is always superior to, and frankly more interesting than, ad hominem attacks. It believes that difficult questions deserve to be engaged with nuance, and it believes there is deep satisfaction and even joy to be found in debate. In short, the forum aims to model the diversity of thought that UVM's amplifying our impact names as essential to UVM's mission. And I will just say, not in my remarks here, just off the cuff, that culture here is bearing out in the conversations the leadership is having around the current situation for higher education. And we are in the middle of intense debates where we are finding better solutions and more interesting solutions as we have those conversations. So I look forward to learning today about maybe a format we could even use in that debating that we are having. And now I'd like to introduce Bryn Geffert, the Dean of our Libraries, to introduce the rest of the event.
Thank you, Linda. And let me first express my gratitude for turning out. One of the drawbacks of scheduling the day before spring break is that you only get the really good, dedicated people to turn out, and I'm grateful to have all of you. I want to particularly recognize the University of Vermont debate team, which is going to be debating this same proposition tomorrow, and our two speakers are going to serve as judges for that debate. And I want to welcome as well the debate team from Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C., who are with us. So we are very fortunate to have with us today two distinguished figures to argue this year's resolution. The First Amendment in the United States, as interpreted by the Supreme Court and federal courts, provides broad protection for speech in the United States. Exceptions are quite few and far between and quite narrowly defined. The First Amendment protects most forms of offensive speech, including most instances of hate speech. In fact, hate speech is not recognized as a category of speech in U.S. law. The European Convention on Human Rights insists that everyone has the right to freedom of expression. But it then goes on to insist that such freedom, and I quote here, may be subject to such formalities, conditions, restrictions, or penalties as are prescribed by law and are necessary to a democratic society. The European Convention explicitly permits restrictions on speech necessary in the interests of, and here again I quote, national security, territorial integrity or public safety, for the prevention of disorder or crime, for the protection of health or morals, for the protection of the reputation or rights of others, for presenting the disclosure of information received in confidence, or for maintaining the authority and impartiality of the judiciary. German law, and the debate today is whether German approaches to free speech ought to be adopted by the US or are preferable to those in the US. Each of our speakers is going to engage that slightly differently. But German philosophy basically accords with the European Convention commitments that I just noted. Sections of the German Critical Code, for example, prescribe punishment for insults and for defamation. Section 90 of the German Critical Code prohibits defaming the German president. It prohibits insults, expressions of contempt of the Federal Republic of Germany, and it prohibits insulting the German flag or coat of arms. Section 103 prohibits speech that assaults the human dignity of others by insulting, maliciously maligning, or defaming segments of the population. It prohibits speech that, quote, incites hatred against segments of the population or a national, racial, or religious group. It prohibits Holocaust denial. Section 166 prohibits defamation of religions, including, quote, faiths, religious societies, and organizations dedicated to a philosophy of life. Such language, of course, would not pass constitutional muster in the United States. So, the question today is, should the United States adopt this approach, and which approach is superior? Two notable figures, and we are so lucky to have with us today. First, Suzanne Nossel, who is the former CEO of PEN America, one of the most active free speech organizations in the United States. She is going to speak against the United States appropriating the German approach to free speech. She's the author of Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All. During the Obama administration, Nossel served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Organizations. Her work has appeared just about everywhere you can imagine, including in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and numerous other publications. Aleksandra Gliszczyńska-Grabias is a professor at the Institute of Law Studies of the Polish Academy of Science and an expert in the field of anti-discrimination law, freedom of speech, and memory laws. She's a co-editor of 2 books. She served as a fellow at Cambridge University, Yale University, Hebrew University, and the European University Institute. And she will be serving as a fellow soon at NYU. Last year, she was appointed to head the advisory council of the Polish Minister of Justice and Prosecutor General on counteracting hate crimes and hate speech. So, in today's debate, Aleksandra will speak in favor of the resolution, Suzanne will speak against the resolution, and then Aleksandra will rebut, and then Suzanne will rebut. Please join me in welcoming our guests.
Thank you very much. I'm so glad and honored to be here. Thank you for the invitation, for the kind introduction. I'm really honored to share the stage with Suzanne, which is I read her so many times before without knowing her, so I'm really feeling privileged to finally meet her. I will start with saying some heretic things to the U.S. audience and to actually share the news, which is a very good news for me. I believe it won't be that you won't react in such an enthusiastic way as I do. But some hours ago, Polish Minister of Justice and Prosecutor General, who is one and the same person in Poland, signed into binding law, something that I have been working on for the last year with my team. And this is the completely new set of rules and principles concerning counteracting hate speech and hate crime. And this is directed to all prosecutors in Poland. And actually, it's modeled on the German approach of counteracting hate speech and hate crime. So it happened today, and I'm really proud of it. And some elements of this approach I will be talking about today. I just need to figure. Oh, okay. So let's start with famous Voltaire, because I believe that the roots of the freedom of speech for both of us, Europe in general, of course Germany as our main case study here, but also US, they are actually the same. So Voltaire, the famous French Enlightenment philosopher, famously stated, "I might disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." So I believe this is a rather radical position on free speech, to be ready to die for someone else's right to speak. And Voltaire died, I need to say, not in the process of defending someone else's speech, but he died the year of the coming into life of a great US Constitution and its first amendment. And I won't be quoting the First Amendment here, but this one of the earlier drafts by James Madison of the clauses, free speech clauses, stated that people shall not be deprived or abridged of their right to speak, to write, or to publish their sentiments. So I believe that also in this philosophical dimension, we come from the same place. But then the legal trajectories went different ways. And why did that happen? As it's always the case, because of politics, because of social conditions, and because of history, because of historical events. And Europe in the 20th century became the place of unspeakable crimes, the Holocaust, but not only, that Americans haven't experienced. I mean, in the 20th century, I want to stress this time factor, which is very important. I'm referring here to the times of the Second World War, or haven't experienced in the same extent and form as the Europeans. And this Philip Roth's famous dystopian novel, The Plot Against America, which shows fictional coming into power of fascists in America, remains what it is, so just fiction. While we in Europe, we have been there, we have gone through all of this, and this historical element will remain like the reference point, one of the most important reference points for me and for what I'm going to say. And when I say we, well, I'm German in 1/4. I hope it qualifies, right? To present these arguments, but we as Europeans as well, because as it was rightfully said, the German model is shared and is part and parcel of the broader European approach towards free speech, now generally accepted, and most importantly by the European Court of Human Rights. It was really like something warm on my heart that you quoted European Court of Human Rights. It doesn't happen very often in the US. And its jurisprudence, its case law on free speech and hate speech in particular. So now what do we talk about when we talk about the German free speech model? There are, of course, various elements of the restrictions being implemented, and I will just tackle some of them. But I think that one of the most important things is that the source and foundation of all rights and freedoms in German constitution, in Polish constitution as well, for my home country, is the principle of human dignity. This is the center. This is the right per se in itself, But this is also a meta right. So all other rights and freedoms are just coming from the human dignity principle. And it's being written in Article 1, the most important article of the German Constitution, which is also called the Basic Law, with a very, very important part of this provision. To respect and to protect human dignity shall be the duty of all state authority. So if this is the duty, it means that the duty encompasses also free speech limitations when this speech is actually attacking human dignity. And generally, the assertion of wrongful facts without connecting them to opinions, to views, is considered in Germany and in Europe more broadly, continental Europe for sure, non-speech. And one of the most prominent examples of this is Holocaust denial and Holocaust denial bans. I will get to them in a moment. Because generally opinions and views are being protected. But when they turn into hate speech, when they start to insult and they start to attack the human dignity, and in particular of vulnerable groups and individuals, then they are overweighted by other constitutional interests and rights, even if they concern issues of public interest that would normally fall into the category of highly protected speech. So where do we differ most? In many respects, but first, this context-specific attitude is important. The dark past of Germany, tragic past, and atrocities committed by Germany. This is like the starting point of understanding a constitutional model of freedom of speech in Germany, but also in other European states. The Constitution, German Constitution, doesn't give the priority and higher status to free speech over not only dignity, but many other rights like honor, personality, even privacy. Of course, it depends on several aspects and elements of a given case. But generally, we can say, also in the context of hate speech, that we in Europe protect the victims of hate speech and not the right of the hater to spread the aggressive speech. And as U.S. Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, in one of many of his opinions presented on free speech, stated that the beliefs of the proletarian dictatorships, when they reach the threshold of being generally accepted or popular, then the only meaning of free speech is that they be given their chance and have their way. Well, in Europe, we don't take this risk of proletarian dictatorships, propaganda being widespread. Quite the opposite. We are very afraid of the consequences of such propaganda, possible consequences, and we put the limits on free speech much before this actual danger can be seen. And yes, now the Holocaust denial being an extreme example of the differences in approach towards free speech limitations. I must say that for me, maybe it's because of my legal European DNA, but knowing that Holocaust denial is allowed and not punished is something deeply disturbing. Even though I know that it's extremely disturbing for you here in the US to think that you can go to jail, like in Austria, for 8 years for stating that Holocaust never happened. 8 years is a lot, right? So I wanted to start with the quote from the letter written by Marian Turski, a very prominent public figure in Poland, a Holocaust survivor. He died 2 weeks ago at the age of 99. He survived 3 concentration camps. And in 2020, he wrote a letter to Mark Zuckerberg about Holocaust denial on Facebook. And actually, he captured in a perfect way also this legal dimension of the Holocaust denial limitations in Europe, where he said that democratic system has its limits when, and I quote, a given individual's or group's actions threaten the freedom of existence of other individual or group. And he continued, I therefore appeal to you that you prevent, not against democracy, but for its sake, Holocaust denial from existing on Facebook. As we know, this call remained, or this request remained unanswered, but still I think it's very telling how we approach this issue of Holocaust denial in Europe and in Germany in particular. So the German Criminal Code regulates Holocaust denial. And the name of the law, Article 130, Paragraph 3, is as long as my last name. I will read it, right? The offense of denial, approval, and downplaying of the Holocaust in a manner suited to causing a disturbance of the public peace with up to 5 years imprisonment. So even downplaying, extremely difficult concept when it comes to legal terms. Like, how do you define downplaying? Right? It's a tricky. It's a dangerous business to define such notions as even approval is problematic. But before 1994, when this provision came into the criminal code, the German courts were dealing with Holocaust denial in various ways. It depended if this was if this was a simple Holocaust denial or qualified Holocaust denial. But then the German legislator said that this is not enough, actually, that we need to do more, because it's not a simple insult. It's something that touches upon the deepest human dignity of all Jews living in Germany, even if they were born, and this was explicitly stated in one of the judgments of the Federal Constitutional Court in Germany, even if they were born after 1945. So all the Jews are the victims of Holocaust denial in Germany, if it happens in Germany. And these Holocaust denial bans, they fall into the broader category and the fascinating category of memory loss, something I have been researching on for the last 8 years. In German, they are called Erinnerungsgesetze, so the laws that regulate the way we publicly speak about the past, the memory and history. How do we remember, and what do we say about remembering, about responsibility for former atrocities? Holocaust denial is one of the most important examples of memory loss, but in Germany there is the whole long catalog of such laws. For example, criminal law puts a ban on glorification of Nazi regime, on displaying symbols of Nazi regime. In Poland, by the way, the same bans apply to the symbols and propaganda and the ideology of communism and Stalinism. So it's also relating and relevant to the historical context of a given place. But this is perhaps something to discuss later on, the attitude towards memory loss. Oh God, I forgot. I'm so sorry. I forgot to change the slide, actually. So, but I think I referred to this in detail. So now the most important part. How would the US benefit from embracing a more German-style approach? For me, it's so obvious that it would, but trying to find the arguments, I thought about it, that this restricting free speech in Germany and in Europe more broadly, it's not about censorship. It's not about just the will to restrict one's freedom. It's about defending democratic values, defending the weaker ones, the vulnerable ones, minority groups, and defending the rule of law as such. And in the times where in particular hate speech and hate speech online crosses all possible red lines and becomes a genocidal attack on various groups, I believe we cannot leave this unanswered also in terms of legal response. And recent examples of this massive disinformation, distortion of facts, have profound consequences. I promise myself I will not refer to politics, but I have to. Can I? Yeah. Well, President Donald Trump's statement that President Zelensky has 4% of support in Ukraine by his own people, with absolutely no factual data standing behind this claim, can have profound consequences for the security also of Poland, just neighboring, bordering Russia and Ukraine. This is serious to the extreme. The result of presidential elections in Romania some months ago, influenced by Russian propaganda. The results of parliamentary elections in Germany that can actually change the whole European system or influence it at least, of politics, because Germany is such a great huge player in this constellation, in this matrix of politics. That's really something that should be perhaps not fully regulated. Is impossible, but some responsibility should be implemented into unrestricted speech of the most important people in the world, but not only them, more generally. And there is this argument about protecting historical truth. I know it can sound particularly controversial, but for me this is a symbolic role of law, to stress the responsibility of the state for former atrocities. But again, we can discuss it. And I will conclude with the reference to a more legal argument, and I would say a technical one. There are different judicial methodologies being used when scrutinizing the restrictions that are being implemented when it comes to the restrictions on free speech and other constitutional rights as well. So we have this majestic pronouncement of the US approach: Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, with an extremely high threshold to meet for any kind of limitations, almost impossible to meet, versus the method actually developed by the German Federal Constitutional Court, the method of proportionality. And I'm a great fan of proportionality test, which actually, yes, tests every time if the restriction implemented was a proper one, and if it was implemented in a good way, and if the restrictive means have been the least restrictive means have been chosen for a given case. So I will stop my heretic arguments here, and I'm really curious to hear what Suzanne is going to say. Thank you for now.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me here today, and it's a great pleasure to be here with you, Aleksandra, and to meet you and be in dialogue with you. So when I first agreed last fall to debate whether the U.S. should adopt the German approach to free speech and censorship, it seemed kind of like an esoteric topic, something only a free speech expert would be interested in. But over the last month, that's actually changed. At February's Munich Security Conference, U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance took the opportunity to chide Europe over what he said was a matter of free speech. He claimed that Germany's internal problems, including the suppression of viewpoints, posed a more proximate danger than either Russia or China. The comments sent shockwaves through the crowds of diplomats and policy analysts. They signaled a deepening rift between the United States and its allies across the Atlantic. Just a few days later, the U.S. news magazine program 60 Minutes aired an episode examining the German approach to hate speech online. The segment included footage of police raids on individuals accused of posting hateful comments and memes on social media. I don't know if you guys saw this. It was pretty striking. These people were found to have broken the law against fanning hatred and faced fines and jail time. The broadcast prompted an outcry here in the United States. Many Americans were shocked that a fellow democracy would crack down so harshly on what we consider here free speech. So I want to be clear in broaching this debate. I don't believe J.D. Vance's criticisms of Germany have much of anything to do with free speech. Vance argued that the decision made by several of Germany's leading political parties to refuse to cooperate with the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland neo-fascist party, infringed on free speech. Yet respect for the protection of free speech does not require the embrace of any particular speech or viewpoint. It does not dictate political alliances. The German parliament, rightly in my view, resoundingly rejected a proposal to ban the AfD. Bans and prohibitions on viewpoints do interfere with free speech, but the rejection and even condemnation of hateful speech and wrongful ideas is actually essential to the protection of free speech. The whole premise of legal protections for free speech is the notion that, as U.S. Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis once put it, the best remedy to combat hateful, harmful speech is more speech, not enforced silence. Speech rebutting, refuting, and rejecting falsehoods, denigration, and bigotry is essential to open discourse. When citizens witness hatred flowing freely through society, and it feels like anyone can say anything they want, people are coming after one another, the impulse then to police and prohibit speech understandably intensifies. This leads to the adoption of restrictive laws and punishments for expression. On the other hand, where hateful views are vocally opposed and marginalized, they shrink in influence. There's no need to call for them to be banned. The reason Germany has strong restrictions on speech, including a ban on Holocaust denial and prohibitions on anti-Semitic and other forms of hateful speech, is because of its history. As ground zero for the spread of a dehumanizing and murderous ideology during the Holocaust, German law is now written to nip that in the bud. Ideally, though, healthy civic exchange depends on self-restraint, social taboos, informal reprisals for speech, and other measures short of bans and punishments that help ensure that malicious speech does not dominate. A political alliance to freeze out an ideologically extremist party is not a matter of law, but rather precisely that sort of voluntary, citizen-initiated restraint. So in this sense, the public debate over German versus U.S. approaches to free speech has been distorted. With that said, though, I am undeterred in my conviction that the proposition we debate today for the U.S. to adopt the German approach to free speech would be unwise, untenable, and ineffective in achieving any purported goals. The most central distinction between U.S. and German approaches to free speech has to do with the idea of incitement. It's speech that urges urges the escalation of conflict. In the U.S., the only form of incitement that can be legally prohibited under the First Amendment is incitement to imminent violence. So if I urge the crowd in this room to attack the man in the front row, I could be legally liable. In Germany and most of Europe, though, they recognize and ban incitement to hatred on the basis of race, religion, ethnicity, or nationality. So if I told you not to attack that man, but rather to hate that man in the front row because he is white or Christian or Canadian, I could be liable for that. They also ban incitement to unlawful acts, so urging the man in the front row to trespass on private property. Germany also prohibits personal insults, including defamation against politicians and malicious gossip against private citizens. So they would ban a lot of the stuff we see every day here on Twitter. My argument against adopting this approach in the U.S. centers on three main premises. One, that the adoption of a German approach to free speech and censorship would depart from the U.S. Constitution, American legal history, and proud U.S. traditions that are vital to positive aspects of American national identity. Two, that the adoption of a German approach to free speech would be untenable in the context of the U.S.'s diverse, heterogeneous, and pluralistic society. And third, that the German approach to free speech has not been shown to be more effective than the U.S.'s when it comes to societal goals and objectives associated with it. So my argument hinges on tradition, tenability, and efficacy, with the prospect of U.S. adoption of the German approach to free speech failing along all three dimensions. First of all, the First Amendment and American traditions. The First Amendment means a lot to Americans. About 75% of Americans know that the First Amendment protects freedom of speech. That's more than can identify the contents of any other part of the US Constitution. In a 2020 survey at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, 94% of Americans said free speech rights were essential to being an American today. Free speech scored higher on that survey than voting rights, equal opportunity, or religious liberty. Beyond that, 85% of Americans have a favorable view of the US Constitution. It matters to them. According to a 2024 poll by the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, free speech is a top concern for Americans in 2024, more so than crime, healthcare, and even immigration. The United States has also invested hundreds of years in analyzing, interpreting, and applying a First Amendment framework. Hundreds of Supreme Court decisions cover every aspect of this edict: freedom of religion, commercial speech, compelled speech, free speech and national security, defamation, fighting words, government speech, obscenity, defamation, and more. The prospect of shifting away from this fundamental freedom in favor of a German approach would upend that entire legacy. It would unmoor the United States from its history and legal precedents. Americans are also anxious about the protection of their free speech rights. Democrats are worried about Republicans encroaching on their speech rights and vice versa. While no one's worried right now about Germans encroaching on our free speech rights, they would be up in arms if they found out that the prospect was afoot. The bottom line is Americans love their free speech. The idea of police banging down a door and putting an American under arrest for something they wrote online would heighten the disorienting sense, a sense many of us have right now, that we're no longer sure what country we live in. Free speech is an underpinning of so much of what makes the United States distinctive. Our world-leading creative industries, including publishing, news media, Hollywood, Broadway, and the visual arts, our universities, which attract students and faculty from around the world, path-breaking research in the sciences and other fields, world-leading technology and media companies at the cutting edge of innovation. All of these creative environments depend upon the freedom to take risks, challenge orthodoxies, have a big personality, defy conventions, speak out of turn, and even cause offense. By turning away from one pillar of the US Constitution, a move toward German approaches to free speech could open the door to casting out or rewriting other clauses of the Constitution. That could then undermine the system of individual rights and checks and balances that has long underpinned our democracy. And we're learning today that that system is vulnerable. It's not something we can take for granted. We're under enough pressure right now. Making this shift would be a huge mistake. In concrete terms, moving away from a First Amendment standard would give the government greater leeway to ban and punish speech. While I suspect the same is true in Germany, when authorities gain such power over speech, they by and large use it self-servingly. They target political enemies, punish the defiant, and suppress narratives that don't flatter them. Let's face it, President Donald Trump is a case in point. He's asserted the power to kick out a news agency, the Associated Press, for failing to heed to his demand to relabel the Gulf of Mexico. The AP has filed a lawsuit challenging his actions under the First Amendment. If our precedents hold, they should win that case, since the First Amendment clearly prevents the government from discriminating on the basis of viewpoints. The Trump administration has now published lists of words and terms like women, elderly, disabled, and more that certain federal agencies are not supposed to use, even in the context like medical research or data collecting for education. That, too, is being challenged in court under the First Amendment. Trump is also suing news organizations for interviews and broadcasts that he argues painted him in an unfavorable light. He's using the leverage of government approval over corporate mergers to press CBS to compensate him for how they edited an interview with then Vice President Kamala Harris. While CBS will almost certainly win under the First Amendment, there are fears that they may be too afraid of antagonizing Trump to even pursue the case. So the First Amendment does not offer complete protection against a vindictive and self-serving president, but it does bring some. The adoption of German free speech law in the United States might yield the same result in some of these cases, but there's an additional force of restraint. That comes from knowing that certain actions would not just break the law, but violate the First Amendment. The idea of violating the First Amendment has a unique resonance. It's not just illegal, it's un-American. We see this just in two developments over the last day. the dean of Georgetown Law School, writing to the Attorney General of Washington, D.C., to push back against a threat to punish the school because of its DEI policies and not to hire graduates from the school. And the dean pushes back, saying, you're violating the First Amendment. Boom. And that becomes big news. CBS, in the lawsuit I mentioned a minute ago, has just filed a motion to dismiss, again, relying on the First Amendment. And people cheer them because they feel like this is standing up for a core American value. My second point is that because the United States is a nation of immigrants and one of the most racially and ethnically diverse countries in the world, stricter policing of speech is impractical and would be a source of intense conflict. An inherent dilemma in trying to contain the spread of offensive speech is where expressive boundaries should be drawn. In U.S. tort law, for example, courts often apply a reasonable person standard. They ask whether a defendant exercised as much care as would be expected under the circumstances. So a reasonable person is defined as one who applies an average level of care, caution, and consideration when, for example, driving a car or taking a pit bull for a walk. In theory, a similar standard might be applied to speech. Whether words, phrases, or slogans are ones that a reasonable person would be on notice were considered hateful or likely to inflict psychological harm. But when it comes to the use of language in a pluralistic society, there is no single reasonable person. Differences of background, upbringing, ethnicity, age, race, religion, socioeconomic status, part of the country you come from, and other factors inflect the meaning of speech in ways that don't affect judgments over how to drive a car or walk a dog. To one person, river to the sea may mean a call for the annihilation of the Jewish state. To another, it can be a rallying cry for the liberation of a beleaguered people. The N-word could be used as a term of endearment by someone in addressing a group of friends, while the exact same term could be profoundly offensive if used by a different speaker, even to the very same audience. Wearing a Halloween costume with a sombrero might be considered fun and festive in some settings, whereas others could see it as playing into a demeaning stereotype. In Germany, it may seem obvious that Holocaust denial should be prohibited, but when I was at the State Department, we faced an argument from Muslim communities saying that the publication of cartoons depicting the Islamic prophet Muhammad should be banned as defamation of religion for the exact same reason that Holocaust denial is banned, that this fans hatred, that this offends religious sensibilities, that this targets a marginalized and vulnerable people. Calling a transgender individual by the wrong pronoun could be an act of deliberate denigration, or maybe just an innocent mistake by a grandmother. But many consider it a denial of existence. If denying existence is banned, does that then become the basis for finding someone or even incarcerating them? These differences are hard enough to navigate today on American college campuses, editorial pages, and social media feeds without the fear that, as in Germany, utterances accused or suspected of crossing the line into unlawful hate speech might get someone not just protested or trolled, but arrested and charged with a crime. Let me give just a few examples of limitations on free speech in Germany that would create enormous controversy in the United States. In October 2023, Berlin's education minister issued a prohibition on wearing a keffiyeh in schools. Given the fervor, anger, and disruption that erupted last spring on U.S. campuses over the Israel-Hamas war, you can imagine how such a prohibition would be greeted here. The argument that a keffiyeh itself constitutes an expression of hateful speech or the endorsement of violence would have been met by claims that IDF sweatshirts or Israeli flags did the same. Aleksandra told me she got punched by someone because she wears a tag in support of the Israeli hostages. You can imagine how that might be seen as a hostile symbol in some quarters. The art world in Germany has been racked with controversies over how visual and performing arts grapple with the conflict. Similar debates in the United States are fervent and combustible enough without having to worry about legal repercussions of speech that may offend. Last year, Bjorn Höcke, the leader of the AfD, was fined by the courts for using the Nazi-era slogan, "Everything for Germany." Höcke denied knowing the historical significance of the seemingly anodyne words. The court wasn't satisfied. All Germans are evidently on notice that there are certain phrases you have to know based on the country's history. But unlike Germany, The United States does not have one single historic episode of bigoted brutality that outweighs all others in collective historical memory. On the contrary, we have chattel slavery, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the internment of the Japanese during World War II, segregation in the Jim Crow South, racial and religious quotas in higher education, the indifference of the AIDS crisis rooted in anti-gay attitudes, anti-immigrant vilification today, and many more. Factoring in all histories, extending equal protections from hate speech to all groups, and educating Americans on what everyone finds offensive so that they don't run the risk of accidentally breaking the law would be mission impossible. My third argument is that I'm not persuaded that the primary rationale for the German approach to hateful speech, that it helps limit and disrupt hateful attitudes and actions, is actually true. The ultimate aim of German free speech law is to prevent the resurgence of anti-Semitism and a return to the horrors of the Holocaust. Yet just last month, we saw the AfD come in second in Germany's national elections. One might explain the rise of the AfD mostly on tensions over immigration, but it's also clear the party is chafing at restrictions on speech relating to the Nazi era and Jews. In 2023, anti-Semitic incidents in Germany rose by 80%. Based on a study by the Anti-Defamation League that year, 42% of Germans believe that, quote, Jews still talk too much about what happened to them in the Holocaust, and 31% believe that, quote, people hate Jews because of the way Jews behave. Germany is also seeing spikes of anti-Semitic crime and violence. Even putting aside the post-October 7th surge, in 2010, German police recorded 1,268 anti-Semitic crimes, which rose to over 2,000 by 2019 and over 3,000 by 2021. So despite Germany's restrictions on hate speech and the most intrusive online censorship laws in Europe, 67% of Germans believe that anti-Semitism in Germany is a problem. German history also cast doubt on whether restrictions on hateful speech tamp down hateful attitudes. Weimar Germany had laws banning hateful speech, and particularly hateful speech directed at Jews. Top Nazis, including Joseph Goebbels and Julius Streicher, served prison time for violating them. Hitler was banned from speaking in several German states in the 1920s. But this muzzling triggered a backlash that has echoes in the complaints about free speech we hear today and that J.D. Vance mouthed in Munich. The Nazis claimed they were being silenced for exposing an international conspiracy to repress true Germans launched by international bankers, Jews, Democrats, and Marxists. Once the Nazis came to power, expansive authorities adopted during the Weimar period to shut down hate-spewing newspapers were turned around to crush political opposition and dissent. We see echoes of this today in the AfD's Hawk calling for nothing less than a 180-degree turnaround in the politics of remembrance. The perceived suppression of speech and press and the press of enforced narratives can trigger a noxious backlash. They can elevate certain ideas and opinions rather than snuffing them out. This is evident in Germany today. After the AfD's Hawk was charged for using the slogan "Everything for Germany" and claimed he wasn't aware of its history, he then used it again, rallying a public audience. This time it was undeniable he knew what he meant. As Germany has translated its approach to hateful speech to the online sphere, imposing fines and even prison terms for those who break the rules in the digital realm, their approach has provided a template for other governments to crack down on online speech. Governments that have modeled Germany's network enforcement law include Russia, Venezuela, India, and Malaysia, prompting headlines like, "The Digital Berlin Wall, How Germany Accidentally Created a Prototype for Global Online Censorship," and "Germany's Online Crackdowns Inspire the World's Dictators." One can only imagine if the United States were to adopt a similar approach, how it would become turbocharged around the world. When scholars or activists muse about prospects for more aggressively policing hateful speech here in the United States, they tend to imagine some mythical combination of a Justice Thurgood Marshall, perhaps a Ruth Bader Ginsburg, or maybe a President Barack Obama judiciously contemplating where these new lines should be drawn. These sages would decide who would need protection, how to detect motives, and how to safeguard genuine debate. But the truth is, that's not how it would work. Any new laws would have to be passed by today's Congress and signed by President Trump. No matter when adopted, as of today, President Trump and his Justice Department would have the power to interpret and enforce the rules, to define what Aleksandra called, quote, wrong facts, to enforce the prohibition on denigration of a president. So would many thousands of judges across the country, each with their own views and perspectives. The alternative to our current system is not some perfectly calibrated paradigm that would protect just enough speech while rooting out what we all here might agree crosses a line. No, it is giving government, whatever government is in power, wider and deeper authority to ban and punish speech. That is not a risk I want to take.
I don't know if you noticed, but I agreed with everything what Suzanne was saying. But I made some notes with some perhaps not counter arguments, because yes, it's a complicated issue. I will pick some things that were said and try to respond. I believe that this point you made about identity, the U.S. identity, that the free speech is so deeply embedded in this identity, I fully agree. But on the other hand, the restrictive attitude is so deeply embedded in the European way that it would, for us, it would also be impossible to accept the free speech model that you so perfectly described, the U.S. model. But I think that this identity here in the U.S. encompasses or should encompass the stricter protection of minorities, because even though this was another argument, the one concerning the diversity, how diverse the U.S. Society is, it's of course true, but it doesn't mean that the minorities, which were also historically the victims of all kinds of wars, crimes, and discrimination, that they do not suffer from the speech directed at them. And this brings me the hateful speech in particular. This brings me to the point about the famous free marketplace of ideas, and all actors responding to speech with more speech, to hateful speech with more speech too. I do not believe that today, and in particular in the U.S., we have the equality on this market. These actors are not equal. There are groups that are very privileged, and the individual victim of hatred that can really break lives. As I practice law also, I have seen examples of victims of hate speech, really drastic examples of what hate speech can cause to an individual. I believe that in the US and elsewhere, of course, too, we cannot claim that we are all equals and just competing with our ideas, and that more speech is the response towards the speech that we do not like. I think that the state should take the responsibility. This brings me yet to another argument about the fact that yes, the government, the authorities decide about the limitations, and that they take the lead in deciding about what's allowed and what's not allowed, and how risky it is. It's true, it's very risky, and we know that it depends on the government. I can turn here to the example of Poland, where the former government introduced the infamous Holocaust bill, where it was actually prohibited with 2 years imprisonment, claiming any responsibility of Poles or co-responsibility of Poles for the crimes committed by the German Nazis during the Second World War, which was clearly an attempt to silence historical debates on the responsibility of Poles for the crimes committed against the Jews during Second World War. So it matters, of course, which authorities decide. But here in the US, perhaps I'm wrong, but I believe that there are other powerful, perhaps much more powerful actors than the government itself who actually regulate this free market place of ideas and regulate what's being allowed and what is being said, what gets into the audience. So if I were to choose whom I want to decide, I would still, perhaps it's again this European approach, I would still prefer the government to take the leading role if I would have to pick who is going to restrict my my free speech. I'm now lost in my my many notes. The effectiveness of yes, you're right. It didn't prevent. I mean, the restrictive approach towards hate speech didn't prevent IDF from being second in the last elections. But there is an obvious problem with implementation of anti-hate speech provisions. And it's a question of how the whole system works. It's not enough to have the provisions written down in criminal codes. It's the way they are being used or not being used, which is very often the case. And also, I believe that we still lack the comparative research results. What works? If the US approach translates into less hatred, or the European approach does so, or the German approach does so. I'm not convinced if we can state what works and what doesn't work when we look at it from the perspective of, which is my main perspective, the protection of vulnerable ones and vulnerable groups. And lastly, before I will just present one more slide. I want to state that for some reasons, for good reasons to my mind, the international human rights protection system, including the European Convention of Human Rights, but also UN Third Convention on Racial Discrimination, etc., and the case law of international monitoring bodies, they accepted the European, the German approach. And this is like the standard of human rights protection, in particular when it comes to restricting hate speech. And I will conclude with one more argument, or yes, the one concerning the concept of militant democracy and the doctrine of militant democracy. This doctrine was coined by, and the term itself was coined by Karl Löwenstein, a German Jewish lawyer who fled Nazi Germany to the US, where his ideas were not welcomed, not really welcomed. So he established the set of policies and laws, like the system of policies and laws that were supposed to limit the rights and freedoms of these who wanted to destroy the democratic system, so the enemies of democracy. And to quote Löwenstein himself, his main question was, how can democracy refrain from democratic fundamentalism and legalistic blindness, which will turn it into a Trojan horse by which the enemy enters the city? So it was a clear reference to Nazis who abused the democratic system and the freedoms and rights, democratic rights, in order to gain power. It was initially directed to limit the existence of some radical parties, political parties and associations, but today the militant democracy doctrine is widespread. It's one of the core, most important elements of constitutional settings in Europe. The question is, of course, how to make it more relevant in today's world. And I will not, of course, tell the US audience who is or who may be the Trojan horse here. But I believe that we should really be aware of the fact that the enemy is entering the city right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Just a few points, and then I hope we'll get to the discussion. I think we could all agree with the idea of stronger protection for minorities, but in practice, the rights of one minority may be pitted against another. And we've seen this vividly on US campuses over the last 18 months, where one person's freedom of speech and right to express their political opinion about the situation in the Middle East is seen by another as an affront to their identity, something that makes them feel unsafe or menaced. Even inviting a particular speaker who represents a certain group, no matter what they say before they even open their mouth on campus, gets positioned as something that is an assault on a vulnerable minority. And so the minute you start policing in that direction to safeguard minorities, I think you get into dangerous terrain. And in the debate over transgender issues, their transgender rights, their rights of biological or cisgender women that can sometimes come into conflict. And our approach here in the United States is we have to be able to discuss and debate these things, that shutting down one side or the other is not the answer, and the debates can be very difficult. And yes, they can be psychologically upsetting, undermining to individuals. It can put them in a difficult position. It can cause even sometimes psychological or physiological harm for people who are subject to slurs and denigration their whole lives. And that's real. And I think we have to contend with that. We have to support those people. We have to respond to offensive and objectionable speech. But I don't think the answer lies in the government regulating and prohibiting it. I agree with Aleksandra that the idea of the marketplace, I didn't talk about the marketplace of ideas, and I do agree that any kind of such marketplace that we have is very flawed and distorted, that it privileges some and not others, that online in particular kind of more speech is not often not a good answer, because it can be just a cavalcade of speech that is in itself silencing. If you say something controversial and there's an onslaught of criticism, no one else is going to want to jump into the debate because it devolves so quickly into vitriol and even threats. So more speech is far from a perfect answer, but I don't think that means the government stepping in is any better. I think we need to elevate lesser heard voices. We need to rebut. We need to condemn hateful and noxious speech. We need to avoid amplifying and algorithmically propelling that kind of speech. But I don't think, again, the answer is the government stepping in to ban it. It worries me to open the door to government control over historical narratives. And, Trump is the perfect case in point. Just, we know right now how he wants to rewrite history with the effort to ban DEI. And so if we open the door to the idea that we want government playing that role, I think, there is no way of controlling it. And we're in the kind of perfect natural experiment right now that I think the framers of the Constitution were worried about. And it comes down to the question, in my mind, is about whether you believe that muzzling hateful speech makes hateful attitudes go away. And I just don't believe that it does. I think, when people feel silence, that they can't express themselves, they can't ask questions, that there's an enforced viewpoint on an issue, the frustration sort of sets in. People feel like there's a piece of tape wrapped around their mouth, and they lash out. And we've seen this here in this country over the last few years. The decision by social media companies to ban the posts about the Hunter Biden laptop, that story that emerged a few days before the 2020 election, because that story had kind of the earmarks of a Russian influence operation, and people thought this was a planted story and the laptop didn't really exist, and this was just a ploy to try to throw the election to Trump and hurt Biden. That, as it turned out, the laptop was real. It was Hunter Biden's laptop. There was no kind of malign operation. Of course, it was a political hit job, and the timing was politically motivated. But the conservative frustration over that incident has fueled an enormous determination to censor. It's fueled a backlash against what's been kind of cast as this whole industry of disinformation, trying to rebut propaganda. That's now been cast as kind of a left-wing conspiracy. There were laws introduced in Texas and in Florida to prohibit social media companies from moderating content at all, because the social media companies are seen to be, or sort of portrayed as being biased against conservatives. You had this whole kind of pas de deux between Trump and Mark Zuckerberg right after the election, again going back to this sense that the social media companies are biased. So I think we have to be very careful about how suppressing speech, it might seem like a good idea, but the ways in which it can backlash and boomerang. And then finally, I will say this slide you showed about militant democracy doctrine, I think could not be more relevant to what we're grappling with today. But to me, it just underscores the notion that, to give this administration or any administration any further power than it has today to dismantle our systems, would only accelerate rather than contain the danger. Thanks.
I forgot we're being recorded. So we have about 20 minutes for questions. We invite questions from the audience, and I ask that you limit your remarks to questions rather than to remarks or speakers. It looks like I'm the one with the microphone, so I'll walk around and hear. Chuck?
Thank you, Bryn. Thank you for that excellent presentation by both of you. A question. Citizens United gave corporations free speech rights. Would changing Section 230, that would take away the ability of companies to monetize the amplification through algorithms of hateful speech, would that be a violation of their First Amendment rights?
Sure. They're different. Section 230 is the immunity that digital platforms have for user-posted content, and it has allowed these companies to become arenas for this very unfettered speech that we now know as the internet and social media. And there are a range of proposals to force companies to take on more responsibility. And in Europe, they've adopted a series of digital regulations that do just that, that force companies to review content, to respond much more quickly to user complaints about content, to create a whole appeals process. And so they don't have that kind of immunity in Europe, and they're putting in a lot of mechanisms and constraints to comply with that law. And I think the jury is sort of still out. It doesn't seem like it's sort of a digital Garden of Eden so far yet in Europe, notwithstanding those regulations. And Germany has the strictest law, network enforcement law, that's been in place for several years. And funnily, my perception is that we don't see as dramatic a response as people kind of both pro and con thought the results would be I think so palpable and visible, and I don't think it's quite panned out that way.
Not yet, perhaps, because with the new Digital Services Act, the regulation being implemented on the European Union's level, that now all member states of the EU are supposed to implement into their national legal systems. This act provides for enormously high financial penalties for these big actors of internet services providers for not complying with also the regulations concerning taking down some contents, and in particular hateful contents, and not monitoring them properly. So perhaps but again, the process of implementing such penalties, even against companies, will take years in each of such a serious cases. And of course, the companies will be represented by best lawyers, and it will take really a lot of time to establish the final verdict in such cases. So there is again the question of implementation and effectiveness. But yes, I agree that the results were not that visible as one would wish or would expect.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes. And then Gary.
Thank you both so much. This was really enlightening. Help me with some nuance. Help me understand something more deeply. I understand constraints on free speech relative to incitement. Are there any constraints on free speech in the U.S. system on blatant untruths? Is there any metric for blatant lies?
Yeah, there are. We have libel and defamation, where if you say something that's untrue, about a person or about a company, and there are different standards depending on whether it's a private individual or a public figure. You have there's more leeway for public debate about a public figure. I mean, if you think about President Trump and the idea of banning defamation against a president, and what would constitute a false claim? If you say he lies, his speech was a pack of lies. Is that a false claim? Some would argue that it is, and so there are those constraints, and there's a whole kind of case law on libel and defamation, and then there are other rules like truth in advertising. FDA regulations where you can't lie about, the result, whether a supplement or medication is effective. And so, there's some constraints, but there also, your example of the comment that Trump made about Zelensky's popularity, I guess in theory that could be a libel claim, but by the time, the problem with it is, of course, the repercussions of it are immediate. And so, any prospect of retroactive liability would not make a difference. But we have seen a couple of important cases in this area that I'll just flag. The case, the Connecticut school shooter, the argument that that the calling those parents of the children who were killed in Newtown, Connecticut, calling them crisis actors and sort of saying that this whole thing was manufactured. They sued and they took Alex Jones down and his whole media empire down and bankrupted him because he knew it was false. He repeated it nonetheless. They were able to demonstrate that it caused them harm. There's also the case against Fox News about the voting machines, that saying that the voting machines, Dominion voting machines, helped throw the election, and that was provably false. The Fox correspondents knew it was false, and they paid a huge settlement in order to avoid a trial in that case. And so there are some recent cases that do put some constraint and some, recognition that you may face the consequences if you knowingly lie.
Thank you. Gary.
Yes, thank you very much. My question may be beyond the purview of today, so if it is, just say thanks, but no thanks. And what I'm wondering about is the role that artificial intelligence might play in free speech in both environments. And I'm thinking specifically of the fact that we're rapidly reaching the point where artificial intelligence software programs can converse and can generate their own speech, and it could be recorded and disseminated. I'm just, again, wondering how that may or may not influence both sides in terms of how that might be regulated or not be regulated.
Well, extremely difficult, and I believe that non-legal system is prepared to give proper responses. It goes far beyond anything that we have experienced so far, and for sure far beyond the traditional speech that we are used to deal with. on the European level, on the level of the Council of Europe and European Commission, there are some attempts, and there is even like a standing committee on artificial intelligence, and also related to free speech issues, how to even try to regulate the cases where there will be, actually, as you said, the artificial intelligence being one of the actors in the free speech debate, or participating in such debates taking place on sometimes very important, crucially important issues. But so far there are no strict regulations. And no responses, like effective responses, how to tackle this challenge, danger. We still don't know.
Yeah, I mean, just say it's not far-fetched. I mean, you can imagine, asking a question in Google, and then that now the AI chatbot yields an answer at the top, and what if that answer is defamatory? They've sort of sucked that answer out of other sources, and one notion is that whoever's created that model should bear responsibility, and I think that's that fear is having a constraining effect, and inducing caution and care in how these models are constructed. But a lot of free speech issues sort of center on questions of intent and context, and there's like no human intent necessarily when a result is spat out by a chatbot. So I think it's going to be very challenging to figure out how to kind of adjudicate that, and how to even, I mean, we're still struggling to apply a set of laws and rules created for kind of the analog physical world into the digital realm and social media. And I think that this takes that complexity to a whole new level.
I have Linda, and then here, and no, okay.
So a question for Aleksandra. Thank you so much for your presentation. And I watched it with deep interest and fascination, so much so that I detailed my question so that I want to make sure nothing is lost in translation. I'm going to have the interpreter read from it. As a Jew, I'm deeply familiar with the history of suffering and resilience in the face of hate speech. When discussing the protection of marginalized groups' dignity, I'm puzzled by the assumption that we're inherently unable to cope with symbols of hate, such as offensive language. Doesn't this presumption undermine our dignity by implying we're fragile and in need of third-party protection from mere words?
That's difficult to translate, perhaps. Thank you for this question. It's like food for thoughts. I don't know if I have a proper response for now, but it's like an element of the for Germany for sure, that it's out of the question that the government takes this responsibility for protecting the dignity of all Jews, not only victims of the Holocaust, but the Jews living in Germany today. I haven't met the, I don't know, even research results saying or presenting this perspective that it could be perhaps something that the Jews themselves do not want. Quite the opposite. The perception is rather that this is rightfully so, that the government, the German government, takes this approach and protects the dignity of the Jewish people again, and the protection against anti-Semitism to the highest possible level. But then, of course, it raises the question about individual perception of such measures. Let me think about it.
I mean, just to say from my perspective, I think it's an important point in that to live in a pluralistic society, you do need some ability to confront and bump up against. People are going to have very different attitudes and are going to say offensive things. I think it's what's really difficult, especially thinking about trying to translate the model to the U.S., is the idea of equal protection. You provide that protection to Jews, and you think that they want it. But what about Muslims? Like, they would like that they would view the Muslim cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad as something deeply offensive, whereas I would say as an American, that's just a cartoon. How could that be? And I remember talking to, when I was at the State Department, I worked on this issue and went to Pakistan. We were talking about it, and they said, well, we wouldn't insult Moses, the sort of Jewish prophet. I said, well, you could, from a Jewish perspective, that's not something that would be particularly upsetting. And so, there are these differences. And I think in this country, we really confront that challenge of, we can't have one set of rules for one group. And, I understand the argument in Germany, but I also think it's now kind of bumping up against these challenges because of immigration and a growing Muslim population. And I'm not sure how long that argument about special status will last, and how it will sort of mesh with the obligations of equal treatment.
If I may just add, because I think it's important, in Germany, but also elsewhere in Europe, this protection against hate speech and hate crime encompasses all groups. It's not only about the Jews and not only against anti-Semitism. The provisions are about hateful speech against the people on the basis of their ethnic, national, religious origin, LGBTQ plus status, disability from some decades now. Historically, these were ethnic, racial, national, religious minorities being protected. I believe that in Germany this specific Jewish context is so important, but generally they also go against anti-Muslim hatred, and there are cases of really severe sentences, including years in prison for Islamophobia. Being adjudicated. So this protection covers also other minorities, even though the German context within the discussion on anti-Semitism and counteracting anti-Semitism is a very particular, singular one.
We have time for one more question. I guess we'll go with proximity.
So I wrote my question out on the computer to help me organize my thoughts. Under the German EU model, online platforms must still justify removal of content and offer avenues for redress. Are these avenues for redress not sufficient to address concerns about inappropriate censorship while still achieving the aim of slowing down rapid dissemination of harmful material?
Can you repeat? Sorry, I got lost. Once again.
So the German EU model requires justification for removal of content and avenues for redress. And I'm basically asking, are these avenues for redress not enough to alleviate these concerns about inappropriate censorship if the individual who has had their content removed can go through this avenue to have their content put back up if they can justify it, while still achieving this overarching aim of the model, which is slow down the rapid dissemination on digital platforms of the material that's considered harmful?
I mean, just, Aleksandra come as well, but, one point to make is that when it comes to speech online, almost all of its reach happens within the first hour. By that, after an hour, it diminishes greatly. After 24 hours, even more. And so the fact that you can lodge an appeal and get your appeal into a queue, and that somebody, a bot might look at it, or maybe even eventually a human being, it actually, if it's revenge porn, or if it's, some defamatory claim about you right before an election, the impact of it can be fully realized before your appeal comes through. And, perhaps we'll get to a point where, the appeal system is well developed enough, and there's a kind of learning loop with content moderation, so that, the content is being pulled down more accurately and with fewer mistakes. But that, that is still a ways off.
I will respond by saying that I have been recently involved in content moderation talks with various biggest actors in the social media arena, and they were. Of course, they were claiming that everything works and it's fine, but it isn't. And there are so many problems, very simple ones. For example, who moderates? How many people are involved? What resources are being put for such moderation? What kind of trainings do these people receive? Not even mentioning all these algorithms and the systems of monitoring. So it's for sure it's not perfect, and it would demand much more resources of all kinds on the side of these companies to invest, which they do not want to do for some obvious reasons, and also for gaining profit from actually some of them, at least, from the hateful discussions going on there, and the whole, even to put it this way, the business of hatred that is being conducted online. So the system is for sure not a perfect one, and it doesn't give the victim of such hatred or other discrimination the proper response, the response that is prompt and quick and effective. It just doesn't work this way.
So before we thank our guests, I want to say that the University of Vermont Press will be publishing a work authored by Aleksandra and Suzanne on just this very topic. Watch for that. Thank you for such thoughtful remarks, and what a gripping time. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.